What if the wildest royal rumours you've ever heard, the mistresses, the secret bribes, the vanishing crown jewels, weren't just whispers, but cold, documented fact? This isn't tabloid fantasy. It's history's most elite family album. Dog weddings, ghost empires, and golden lies all included. From the Congo to Versailles to your local taxpayer-funded palace, these are the 53 royal scandals that actually happened, and somehow the truth is always stranger than the myth. Before we dive in, if you love strange history, royal chaos, and the kind of stories that make you double-check Wikipedia at 2 a.m, hit that subscribe button. It keeps the mysteries coming. And while you're here, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop your country and the time down in the comments, because let's be honest, this is probably not the hour you plan to fall into a royal rabbit hole. 1. King Leopold II's Congo regime. There are few royal scandals so vast, so coldly bureaucratic, that they read more like corporate horror than conquest. But King Leopold II of Belgium wasn't your average monarch. He was a man who looked at the world map, saw a giant patch of Central Africa and thought, this could be my personal startup. Technically, it was called the Congo Free State. In reality, it was the world's most horrifying private venture. An entire country owned not by Belgium, but by Leopold himself. He didn't even bother hiding it. The free in its name was almost performance art. Under the guise of civilization, Leopold ran a rubber and ivory empire powered by forced labor, mutilation quotas, and public floggings. Men, women, children, everyone was a potential ledger entry. Reports from missionaries and whistleblowers began to seep out. Stories of villages razed, hands severed for missed rubber quotas, and entire communities extinguished. But this was the late 19th century, and Europe wasn't in a hurry to shame its own reflection. It took decades of activism and one photographic exposé to force the Belgian parliament to finally annex the territory in 1908, effectively yanking it from Leopold's private grip. By then, millions were already dead. We don't even have a precise number. And here's the kicker. Leopold never stepped foot in the Congo. He orchestrated the whole thing from elegant parlours in Brussels, with gilded ceilings and moral vacuum. He died wealthy, reviled by some, still honoured by others. A few statues remain, occasionally defaced, rarely removed. The real mystery isn't whether the rumours were true. They were verified with documents, testimony, and even economic data. The mystery is how long it took anyone to care, and how easy it was to turn people into revenue. Which brings us to another royal who took bribes like it was just another Tuesday. Let's talk about a prince, an airplane company, and the cost of a handshake. 2. Prince Bernhard and the Lockheed bribes. Once upon a mid-century, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands had it all. Royal title, charming accent, Nazi-sympathetic past quietly papered over, and access to global power circles via a well-pressed military uniform. But what he really had, according to court investigators, was a soft spot for American corporate money. In the 1970s, Lockheed Martin, then just Lockheed, was caught handing out envelopes like party favours to grease arms deals across the globe. One of those envelopes landed squarely in Bernhard's lap, or rather several did. The Dutch public had long heard whispers of shady defence deals and princely indulgences, but few expected the scandal to unravel in the blunt bureaucratic fashion that it did. A full parliamentary inquiry confirmed it. Bernhard had accepted bribes. Not speculative, not tabloid fiction, verified. He denied it, of course, then walked it back. Then agreed to step down from all military and political roles. But curiously, he was never prosecuted. Instead, the monarchy shrugged. He remained His Royal Highness, a little lighter in power, but not in dignity, at least officially. The truly Dutch part. Queen Juliana threatened to abdicate in protest of the political treatment of her husband. The monarchy nearly crumbled from within, not because of the scandal, but because people tried to take it seriously. So why did this all matter? Because it confirmed something ugly. Royalty could be bought just like anyone else. The crown didn't purify a man's ethics, it just dressed them better. Of course, some monarchs didn't wait for bribes. They built empires of extravagance straight from the treasury, which takes us to the next royal scandal, where ego met empire, and the result was gold-plated chairs, powdered wigs, and dead schoolchildren. By the way, if you're still with us 2 scandals deep, you might as well make it official. Tap that subscribe button so you don't miss the rest of the royal chaos still to come. And while you're here, where are you watching from and what time is it? Because nothing says normal Tuesday night like unraveling 100-year-old royal bribe schemes at 3 a.m. 3. Emperor Bokassa's bloody coronation. It was 1977, and in the Central African Republic, Emperor Jean Bedel Bokassa decided he wasn't just a president, he was destiny. So he threw himself a coronation that made Versailles look modest. The French helped bankroll it, naturally. After all, Bokassa was their favourite useful autocrat. He wore a crimson cape modelled after Napoleon's, sat on a throne shaped like a giant golden eagle, and had his crown placed on his own head because no one else was good enough. The coronation cost over $20 million, about a third of the country's annual budget. Meanwhile, most of his citizens couldn't afford shoes. But here's where the rumours turned from ridiculous to rotten. That same year, high school students protested Bokassa's decree that forced them to buy overpriced uniforms from his wife's company. Their peaceful defiance ended with mass arrests, and what followed was unthinkable, except it happened. Dozens of children were reportedly beaten to death in prison. For years, it was dismissed as propaganda, until witnesses came forward, documents emerged, and a French investigation confirmed the accounts. Bokassa, who once proudly declared himself the father of the nation, was now openly accused of killing its children. The French, suddenly squeamish, helped remove him in a quiet coup. He fled. When he returned, years later, to face trial, the spectacle was surreal. He claimed sainthood, literally, said he had visions. The court disagreed. He was convicted of murder and embezzlement, though not executed. And here's the kicker. He was eventually pardoned. He died a free man in his hometown, with some still calling him emperor. What remains isn't just the horror, it's the theatre. The way power can costume itself, declare itself divine, and demand applause, and how easy it is to confuse insanity for ceremony. Next, we turn to a different kind of royal exile, one who wasn't overthrown, but quietly slipped away in the night. From coronation to evasion, let's follow the money to Spain. 4. Juan Carlos V and the financial scandals. Juan Carlos V was once the darling of modern monarchy. He smiled through Spain's post-Franco transition, waved at democracy, and even thwarted a military coup with a dramatic televised speech that made him a symbol of unity. For decades, Spaniards treated him like royal Teflon, untouchable, unblemished, necessary. And then came the helicopters. Not metaphorically, actual helicopters ferrying him into private hunting trips with foreign businessmen, while his finances increasingly resembled a labyrinth of offshore accounts, mysterious donations, and contracts with too many zeros and too few receipts. The whispers turned to newspaper exposés. Spanish and Swiss prosecutors opened investigations into a dizzying array of alleged money laundering operations, foreign gifts, including hundreds of millions from Saudi royals, and undeclared income. The public, meanwhile, watched in real time as the image of their constitutional monarch dissolved like sugar in espresso. Eventually, Juan Carlos fled. Not into exile, technically, just somewhere else. That somewhere turned out to be the United Arab Emirates, a land conveniently devoid of extradition agreements and rich in privacy. The official explanation: he was doing it for Spain's sake. The investigations dragged on for years. Some were dropped, others fizzled. No criminal charges ever stuck, but it didn't matter. The damage was terminal. Juan Carlos had gone from hero to footnote in the most embarrassing way possible. Not toppled by enemies, but quietly boxed out by his own reputation. He abdicated in 2014 in favour of his son, Felipe VI, who began stripping his father's royal stipends and renouncing his inheritance in an effort to sanitize the family brand. And yet the mystery lingers, not of guilt or innocence, but of motivation. Why gamble a revered legacy on opaque wealth? Why risk it all for envelopes, transfers, and favours from Gulf monarchies? The answer may be in the same impulse that haunts many royal houses, the belief that status is insulation, that power means freedom, that the rules are for subjects, not symbols. Speaking of symbols behaving badly, our next monarch didn't just flirt with fascists, he invited himself over for tea. 5. Edward VIII's Nazi ties. Long before he became the Duke of Windsor, royal exile, style icon and cautionary tale, Edward VIII was King of the United Kingdom for exactly 11 months. He abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, the twice-divorced American socialite who supposedly made his heart sing and his sense vanish. But the real scandal was never just the abdication. It was what came after. Because in 1937, Edward and Wallis took a little European honeymoon. Stops included fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Yes, that Nazi Germany, complete with a chummy photo op with Adolf Hitler himself at the Berghof. British intelligence and German archives later revealed even worse. The Duke had corresponded with Nazi officials. More than once. Cables uncovered after the war, the infamous Marburg files, suggested that Nazi leaders believed Edward might be reinstated as king if Britain fell to Germany. There were plans, real ones, in which Edward would return to rule a defeated Britain as Hitler's puppet. The British government, understandably horrified, tucked Edward away in the Bahamas for the duration of the war, appointing him governor of the colony. Far from Europe, far from microphones, far from temptation. Afterward, he returned to a life of sulking in Paris, writing autobiographies with selective memory and issuing bitter remarks about how unfair it all was. He maintained that he was misunderstood, that the Hitler visit was just polite diplomacy. But official records, intercepted communications, and historical consensus say otherwise. Edward's loyalties were not simply misguided. They were morally compromised, if not actively treasonous. And yet, the British royal family never disowned him. They distanced, yes. But disowned? Never. He kept his title, kept his allowance, and kept posing for magazine spreads like monarchy was just a misunderstood lifestyle brand. Why does this matter? Because it suggests a monarchy not just adjacent to authoritarianism, but at times open to alignment with it. Because love wasn't the only reason Edward gave up the crown. Let's stay in Europe for the next one, but with a twist. Our next royal didn't flirt with political scandal. He just had children, quietly, outside of wedlock, twice. 6. Prince Albert II's secret children. When you rule Monaco, a microstate that's basically a tax shelter with a coastline, image is everything. Prince Albert II, son of Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier, knew this better than most, but even Hollywood lineage can't script away real-life complications, especially when they're born. For years, rumours swirled about Albert's romantic life. He was suave, elusive, and consistently single. The press loved the mystery. But in 2005, just before his official ascension, the story cracked open. A California woman named Tamara Rotolo came forward claiming Albert had fathered her daughter, Jasmine Grace Grimaldi. Albert, after some lawyerly hesitation, confirmed it. A paternity test sealed the deal. He even met with Jasmine and granted her financial support, though she would never be in line for the throne. Then came child number 2. In 2014, a second revelation. Alexandra Grimaldi Coste, born to a Togolese former flight attendant, Nicole Coste. Another paternity test, another confirmation. That made 2 public admissions, 2 private relationships, 2 children outside the royal spotlight until they weren't. To be fair, Albert has since embraced both children to varying degrees. But the timing was telling. The revelations came not long before and after his marriage to South African swimmer Charlene Whitstock, a marriage already strained by rumours, cold body language and press speculation about tearful public moments and alleged escape attempts. The issue wasn't illegitimacy per se. Monaco isn't medieval. The issue was secrecy. A prince crafting the illusion of a pristine, duty-bound bachelor king while quietly navigating complex personal entanglements behind palace doors. In Monaco, where every square inch radiates curated elegance, the truth was a little less curated and a lot more human. But Albert's paternal surprises were just the beginning. Let's move to another Belgian royal who denied, until DNA left him with no more excuses. 7. King Albert II and the paternity test. For decades, King Albert II of Belgium wore the crown with practiced grace. He was the kind of monarch who shook hands, made speeches and posed for postcards. He projected calm, civility, and the comforting illusion that nothing scandalous ever happened behind palace walls. That illusion lasted right up until a woman named Delphine Boel showed up and said essentially, "Hi, Dad." Delphine had spent her life hearing whispers that she was the unacknowledged daughter of the king. Her mother, Baroness Sibylle de Célys-Longchamp, had reportedly had a long-term relationship with Albert before he became king. The affair was one of those courtly open secrets, not officially confirmed, but not exactly denied either. Delphine, an artist by profession, wasn't interested in money. She wanted recognition, dignity, the simple, scandalous act of being acknowledged as her father's child. What she got instead was a legal odyssey. For years, Albert denied paternity outright. His lawyers fought tooth and nail to keep the case from proceeding. But Belgium is not a fairy tale kingdom. It has courts and DNA tests. In 2020, after years of denial, avoidance and media theatre, Albert was compelled by a court to take a paternity test. The result? Positive. Unequivocally, she was his daughter. The former king released a statement acknowledging the result, grudgingly. There was no tearful reunion, no redemption arc, just a royal hand forced by science. It was a peculiar twist in Belgian royal history, a story that sounded like fiction. Unacknowledged daughter of a king battles the establishment and ended with court-ordered truth. Delphine was later granted the title Princess of Belgium and officially recognized as part of the royal family. But the emotional distance lingered. This wasn't a story about a family mending its ties. It was a story about how even monarchs can't hide from modern institutions, that DNA doesn't care about dignity, and that sometimes the palace doors only open when forced. Let's turn the clock back now, way back, to a French king whose personal life was so scandalous they had to build a second house just to contain it. 8. Louis XV and the secret house of mistresses. Louis XV had Versailles, but apparently Versailles wasn't quite enough. As the King of France in the 18th century, Louis had access to nearly everything. Military might, artistic genius, silk by the mile. And still, he felt the need to construct a shadow Versailles, a discreet house near the palace grounds, known as the Parc aux Cerfs. This house wasn't for guests or diplomats, it was for women, mistresses plural, recruited, installed, and rotated in and out like courtiers of secrecy. The women were often young, from modest backgrounds, and kept away from public view. The arrangement was known to insiders and whispered about by outsiders, but the monarchy never formally admitted it. For a long time, the idea of a private royal pleasure house sounded like slander, a revolutionary fantasy. But historical research, backed by memoirs, correspondence, and expense records, confirms it. The Parc aux Cerfs existed. Maintained with public funds, operated with royal knowledge. Louis, nicknamed the Well-Beloved in his youth, saw his popularity erode under the weight of scandals like this one. While France struggled with economic strains and growing inequality, the image of a king indulging in secret affairs within walking distance of Versailles did not age well. The irony? Louis wasn't even discreet about his more official mistresses. Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry were household names, fixtures at court, influencers of policy and art. But the women in the Parc aux Cerfs were kept separate, out of the public eye, out of the historical spotlight, until the evidence came pouring out. It raises an unsettling question. Why did Louis maintain two systems of indulgence, one public and one hidden? The answer might lie in the timeless royal need to control not just the narrative, but the optics. His public mistresses were curated, charismatic, palatable. The others were compartmentalized. The monarchy fell not long after his grandson's reign, and while no single scandal brought it down, each piece chipped away at the illusion of divine rule. The Parc aux Cerfs is one of those pieces, a quiet monument to the monarchy's appetite for indulgence over accountability. Now let's leave the elegance of Versailles and head to a very different palace, one filled not with silks and salons, but a kleptomaniac king with a taste for other people's silverware. 9. King Farouk and the royal kleptomania. By the time King Farouk of Egypt was ousted in 1952, he had stolen everything but the title deed to the Sphinx, or so the joke went. Farouk's reign was filled with extravagance, but not the noble kind. He was a man who blended compulsive collecting with a baffling disregard for consequence. The rumor was that he was a kleptomaniac, not just metaphorically, but literally, and as it turns out, the rumors were true. He allegedly snatched a pocket watch from Winston Churchill, took ashtrays from hotels, walked off with artifacts, coins, and cufflinks from foreign dignitaries. His staff reportedly trailed behind him on visits, quietly returning stolen items to avoid diplomatic incidents. And that was just the casual stuff. Behind palace walls, Farouk amassed one of the most opulent private collections of coins, jewels, and art in the region. At one point, he reportedly owned over 8,500 rare coins and medals. Not that he earned them, they just appeared. Farouk ruled Egypt during a time of great internal tension. Poverty and nationalism were rising. Colonial entanglements with Britain loomed large, and in the middle of it all, the king was hoarding Fabergé eggs and Italian sports cars. His personal weight became a metaphor for excess, both literal and symbolic. He was finally overthrown in a military coup led by the Free Officers movement. He fled to Italy aboard a royal yacht, taking with him a mountain of personal possessions and very little dignity. Later inventories of his belongings stunned even seasoned appraisers. Solid gold dinnerware, a collection of pornographic playing cards, and of course, more stolen foreign memorabilia than anyone knew what to do with. Farouk's downfall wasn't just a revolution, it was a reckoning. His compulsive greed was so outlandish, it undermined the last fig leaf of royal seriousness. And yet, the story of Farouk wasn't about one man losing control. It was about what happens when an entire system allows power to become parody. Next, we move east to a prince with access to billions and a spending habit that would make even Farouk blush. His lifestyle made headlines, lawsuits, and more than a few gasps in court. 10. Prince Geoffrey Bolkiah and the billion-dollar lifestyle. If King Farouk was a kleptomaniac, Prince Geoffrey Bolkiah of Brunei was an open-book cautionary tale about what happens when a royal taps directly into one of the world's richest oil funds and treats it like a personal ATM. As the younger brother of Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah, Geoffrey was, for a time, Minister of Finance, head of the Brunei Investment Agency, and effectively one of the gatekeepers of the tiny nation's staggering oil and gas wealth. The rumours started with numbers so absurd they read like satire. Yachts named Tits and Nipple, a fleet of over 2,000 cars, entire hotels bought as toys, and artwork purchased on whims. For years, skeptics thought it was exaggerated, the product of jealous tabloids or envious observers. But then the litigation began. In the 1990s, auditors discovered that billions, yes, billions of dollars were missing from state-linked funds. Lawsuits in London, New York, and Brunei itself exposed the financial black hole. Testimony and court filings painted a picture of a prince who had burned through somewhere between £10 and $15 billion. Entire companies were set up to move money around. Properties from Las Vegas to London became pawns in a sprawling tug-of-war between the Brunei government and its prodigal royal. What makes Geoffrey's saga more than just tabloid fodder is how nakedly it confirmed the rumours. This wasn't speculative accounting, it was forensic. Asset lists, purchase orders, invoices. The details were absurd enough to be comedic. Gold-plated bathroom fixtures, commissions for statues, private parties so extravagant they made headlines. But the consequences were deadly serious for Brunei's credibility as a steward of public wealth. Eventually, the Sultan forced a settlement. Geoffrey agreed to return much of what he could, but like many such settlements, the full picture of what was lost, where it went, and who benefited remains murky. The prince still lives comfortably, albeit on a shorter leash. It's a story not of poverty amid plenty, but of plenty turned into parody. A prince with no brake pedal, and a government too tied to family loyalty to intervene until it was almost too late. And yet, if you think Geoffrey's excess was unusual, consider a Moroccan sultan whose rumoured offspring seemed mathematically impossible until demographers started running the numbers. 11. Sultan Moulay Ismail's record-setting progeny. Moulay Ismail of Morocco reigned from 1672 to 1727 and for centuries occupied a strange space in royal folklore. Chroniclers said he had fathered hundreds of children, 5, 6, even 800. European observers scoffed. Impossible, they said, just another orientalized myth, a product of travelers' exaggerations. But Moulay Ismail was no ordinary monarch. He ruled with an iron hand, built monumental structures, and maintained a vast court. Polygamy among rulers was not unusual. What was unusual was the scale. Modern researchers decided to test the claim. In 2012, a group of geneticists and demographers modeled the likelihood. Using conservative fertility rates and lifespans, they concluded that the rumored number was not only possible, but plausible, if the Sultan had access to a large harem, frequent relations, and decades of reproductive opportunity. Which he did. The numbers fit. Hundreds of wives and concubines, and an organized court that effectively systematized reproduction as a state project. In other words, the legend of Moulay Ismail's superhuman fertility turned out to be not legend, not a moral fable, a demographic fact. Why does this matter? Because it upends how we view royal myths. Often we assume exaggeration, caricature, or propaganda. But sometimes the extraordinary really is just administration at scale. Moulay Ismail didn't defy biology, he exploited its margins. The implications weren't purely domestic. His progeny spread across Morocco's elite, creating a web of familial alliances that lasted for generations. In many ways, it was politics by paternity. It also raises uncomfortable questions about power and people. When lineage itself becomes a tool of statecraft, are children heirs or inventory? The Sultan's court documents don't answer, they merely record. From Morocco's palaces, let's cross the continent to the Qing dynasty in China, where another royal court produced a different kind of excess, not of children, but of corruption so vast it made even the emperor flinch. 12. Heshen and the corruption of the Qing court. Heshen began life as a low-ranking bannerman in the Qing Imperial Guard. By sheer charm and political skill, he became the favorite of Emperor Qianlong in the late 18th century. He was handsome, ambitious, and by all accounts preternaturally good at court intrigue. The emperor showered him with titles and power, making him one of the most influential officials in China. Then the rumors started. Heshen wasn't just powerful, he was rich, inexplicably rich. His estates grew, his households multiplied, and the flow of silver into his coffers dwarfed anything a single official could plausibly earn. People whispered about bribes, embezzlement, and favoritism on a scale China had never seen. When Qianlong died in 1799 and his successor, the Jiaqing Emperor, came to full power, the whispers became indictments. Heshen was arrested within days of the old emperor's funeral. Inventories of his seized property read like a fantasy novel. Mountains of silver, gold ornaments, jewels, art, land holdings, warehouses stacked with goods. Conservative estimates place Heshen's fortune at over 1.1 billion silver taels, an amount equivalent to the empire's entire annual revenue. In modern terms, tens of billions of dollars. Heshen's fall confirmed everything the rumors had suggested. He wasn't just corrupt, he was an institutional failure personified. His wealth symbolized the stagnation of a dynasty more interested in patronage than reform. The court sentenced him to death by his own hand and confiscated his assets. But even in disgrace, Heshen's story lingers. It's not just a morality tale about greed, it's a lesson in how absolute favoritism breeds absolute rot. For years, people assumed the whispers about his fortune were exaggerated. They weren't. The records still exist. From Heshen's mountain of silver, we shift to another royal tragedy, this time in Korea, where a crown prince's rumored madness turned into one of the most infamous palace episodes ever written down. 13. Crown Prince Sado and the rice chest execution. At first, Crown Prince Sado of Korea's Joseon dynasty seemed like the ideal heir. Born in 1735, he was intelligent, elegant, and adored by his mother. But as he aged, the prince's behavior turned darker. By the time he was in his 20s, court officials and family members whispered of erratic moods, violent outbursts, and a growing trail of fear in the royal palace. These rumors lasted generations, but they weren't idle gossip. They were carefully documented, most notably by Sado's own daughter-in-law, Lady Hyeong, in her now famous memoirs. She wrote of Sado's behavior, sudden disappearances, obsessions, paranoia, and terrifying fits of rage. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. In 1762, his father, King Yongzhou, was faced with a dilemma. Royal custom made it nearly impossible to execute a crown prince outright. To kill one's own heir was to destabilize the heavens themselves. But to let Sado continue was a risk to the entire court. So the king found a loophole. He ordered his son confined in a large wooden rice chest in the summer heat. It was an execution in all but name. After 8 days, the prince was dead. For years, the story seemed too cruel to be true. Palace myth, perhaps, or Confucian propaganda. But it wasn't. Historical records, memoirs, and royal chronicles corroborate the tale. It wasn't just a metaphor. It happened. Later generations struggled to reconcile it. Some viewed Sado as a tragic figure, mentally ill and abandoned by a father obsessed with Confucian ideals. Others saw the king's decision as one of grim necessity. Either way, the result was the same, a royal death sealed inside a box and left to be remembered only through court records and family memoirs. The legacy of Sado still haunts Korean history. His son, King Jongjo, went on to become one of Korea's most admired rulers, and he spent much of his reign quietly rehabilitating his father's reputation, even as the facts remained chilling. From Korea's palace prisons, we move to Japan, where another ruler's strange obsession didn't result in death, but in a countrywide decree to protect four-legged citizens at all costs. 14. Shogun Tokugawa Tsunayoshi and the Rule of the Dogs. When Tokugawa Tsunayoshi became the fifth shogun of Japan's Edo period in the late 1600s, he brought with him an unusual passion, an almost spiritual reverence for animals, especially dogs. Born in the year of the dog and steeped in Buddhist teachings, he took the connection seriously. Too seriously, according to some. He issued a set of edicts known collectively as the Shorui Awarami no Rei, laws of compassion for living things. The intention wasn't outrageous. On the surface, they were rules against cruelty, but Tsunayoshi's commitment went well beyond compassion. His policies banned the killing of dogs, yes, but also the harming of animals in any form. Even pest control was frowned upon. Soon, the capital city of Edo, now Tokyo, was filled with stray dogs, thousands, then tens of thousands. The government built shelters, actual facilities, to house and feed them, reportedly at the state's expense. Some historians estimate over 50,000 dogs were living in these facilities at the peak of the policy. The shogun's intentions were moral, but the effect was comical, even chaotic. Officials tasked with enforcing the laws often faced backlash from frustrated citizens. Farmers and townspeople protested quietly about their inability to protect crops or homes. All while tax money flowed into dog food, bedding and shelter maintenance. The nickname stuck, the dog shogun. Historians debated the purpose of the edicts for centuries. Was it a philosophical overreach, a ruler too far removed from the practical lives of his people? Or was it part of a larger moral experiment trying to reshape Japanese society around a form of ethical purity that proved unworkable in practice? The laws weren't permanent. After Tsunayoshi's death, they were swiftly repealed. The shelters were closed, the dogs dispersed, or worse. But the memory endured. Tsunayoshi remains one of Japan's most polarizing historical figures, not for conquest or war, but for canine policy so extreme it changed the rhythm of daily life. Now, from dogs to drinks, we travel to the Ottoman Empire, where one sultan waged war on alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, while indulging in exactly the things he banned. 15. Sultan Murad IV and the Hypocrite's Ban. In the early 17th century, the Ottoman Empire was tense, tired, and teetering. Enter Sultan Murad IV, a young ruler determined to restore order. His method? Ban everything. Alcohol, tobacco, coffee houses, gone. These weren't just rules, they were enforced with terrifying energy. Murad IV reportedly disguised himself and wandered the streets of Istanbul at night, catching violators personally. Punishments were swift, harsh, and public. Coffee houses, which had become popular hubs of conversation and criticism, were shuttered en masse. The edicts earned him a reputation for discipline and fear. Under Murad, the streets of the capital grew quieter. Dissidents went silent. Even the whisper of rebellion seemed dangerous. But here's the twist. Behind palace doors, sources say Murad indulged in the very vices he banned. Contemporary chronicles suggest he drank heavily, possibly to cope with migraines or melancholy. He may have used the very substances he criminalized. Historians caution against assuming total hypocrisy. It's possible Murad made exceptions for himself while enforcing discipline on others, a sort of royal privilege cloaked in moral rhetoric. But the effect was the same, a monarchy that preached one code for the people and lived another in private. His reign was short and volatile. He died at age 27, leaving behind a court exhausted by fear and contradiction. His successors reversed many of his bans, and Murad's moral crusade became another cautionary footnote in Ottoman history. a ruler who sought control through purity, and perhaps lost both in the process. Still, the hypocrisy lingers in historical memory. The idea that power often hides its own indulgence while criminalizing everyone else's. And on that note, let's return to England, where one famously lionized king carried a literal rot inside him, even as he thundered through 6 marriages and rewrote the rules of church and state. 16. King Henry VIII's foul, ulcerated leg. By the end of his reign, King Henry VIII of England was less a monarch than a metaphor, one man embodying an entire empire's ambition, instability, and personal decay. He had broken from Rome, married 6 women, restructured religion, and expanded royal power. But behind the political legend was a secret his courtiers couldn't ignore, no matter how much they tried. The king's leg was rotting. The rumours began in the 1530s. Henry, once athletic and dashing, grew increasingly reclusive, irritable, and slow. His once famed jousting days were over, thanks in part to a serious fall in a tournament, an incident that left his leg injured and never fully healed. Over time, the wound turned chronic. Doctors of the day, armed with the most advanced 16th century guesswork, tried various treatments: poultices, draining, cauterizing, herbal compresses. None worked. The wound would break open repeatedly, releasing pus and swelling with infection. He wore heavy padding to conceal the problem, but the smell, according to several records, was unmistakable. This wasn't idle gossip. Foreign ambassadors noted it in their letters. Courtiers whispered about the king's mood swings and weight gain, attributing much of it to constant, untreated pain. His ability to walk declined. Audiences were shortened. Throne appearances became less frequent. Modern medical historians now believe the ulcer was likely a varicose vein that ruptured or an injury compounded by diabetes or thrombosis. Whatever the cause, the result was a physical deterioration that mirrored the king's increasingly volatile rule. Why does this matter? Because monarchies are built on image, and Henry's image, virile, commanding, almost divine, was silently collapsing. Even as he thundered through marriages and reshaped Christendom, his body was betraying him. The man who ruled England with terrifying certainty couldn't rule his own leg. Still, his courtiers never mentioned it in public. Portraits remained flattering. Official documents made no reference to his worsening condition, but inside the walls of Hampton Court and Whitehall, everyone knew. From one royal secret to another, our next scandal comes from a future king who married illegally and kept it quiet even as the law of the land said he couldn't. 17. George IV's secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. Before he was George IV, he was the Prince of Wales, and arguably the most flamboyantly irresponsible heir Britain ever produced. His gambling debts were legendary, his affairs well publicized, and his taste for luxury utterly unrestrained. But one decision towered above the rest in its scandalous brilliance. He secretly married a Catholic widow. Her name was Maria Fitzherbert, and she was everything Parliament didn't want in a future queen. For starters, she was a Catholic. A problem, since British law explicitly barred heirs from marrying Catholics without forfeiting their claim to the throne. Second, she was a commoner, twice widowed and thoroughly unsanctioned. In 1785, George married her anyway. The ceremony was private and performed by a priest willing to look the other way. There were no trumpets, no proclamations, no official recognition. Just love, stubbornness, and royal impulsivity. For years, the marriage was a public secret. The prince denied it when convenient and hinted at it when dramatic flair suited him. He eventually married Caroline of Brunswick, officially, legally, and miserably, in order to secure Parliament's financial favour. But the Fitzherbert marriage never truly went away. Maria kept the certificate. Letters between them survived. George later referred to her as his true wife and requested to be buried with her miniature portrait. After his death, the papers were examined by senior officials, and the marriage's validity, while legally moot, was personally confirmed. The monarchy's response? Silence. The British state quietly pretended it never happened. George's flamboyant hypocrisy, marrying for love, then for money, then pretending neither counted, was too tangled to confront. Why does this matter? Because it revealed that even the most powerful royal heir could not reconcile personal desire with public duty. He broke the law, then ignored it, then leveraged it for attention. And yet the kingdom didn't crumble. The monarchy rolled on. Scandal became routine. And speaking of royal disasters, let's talk about a king who lost more than his reputation. He lost the crown jewels, literally. 18. King John and the lost crown jewels in the wash. Some royal mishaps are symbolic, others are just logistical nightmares. King John of England managed to achieve both when, in 1216, he marched his army and his treasure into a tidal estuary called the Wash, and came out with significantly less of both. John was already deeply unpopular. His reign had seen baronial revolts, excommunications, and the forced signing of the Magna Carta. He was perpetually fighting to maintain control. His finances were a mess, his enemies were many, and his royal legitimacy was hanging by a thread. In a moment of desperation and strategic miscalculation, he attempted to move his household and royal treasury across the marshy flatlands of eastern England. The area, known as the Wash, was famous for its treacherous tides and quicksand-like terrain. John's baggage train, heavy with carts, gold, silver, and royal regalia, took a separate route from the king. Then came the tide, fast, merciless, and entirely uncooperative. The baggage carts became stuck. The horses flailed. The tide surged in. By the time it receded, the royal treasure, including, it is said, the crown jewels, was gone, swallowed by the sea and sand. Chroniclers of the time described the event with a mix of awe and mockery. It was a fitting metaphor for a reign defined by arrogance, failure, and poor planning. Historians today still debate the details. Some suggest only part of the treasury was lost. Others say the entire royal cash vanished, but the consensus is clear. Something valuable sank, and it has never been recovered. Modern archaeologists have attempted to locate the lost treasure, using everything from sonar to medieval maps. Nothing definitive has ever been found. The mystery remains, an enduring echo of royal clumsiness at a time when symbols of power mattered more than the actual power itself. King John died shortly afterward, likely from illness and stress. His reign ended in confusion, but his reputation was sealed not just by rebellion or political defeat, but by losing the most literal symbols of monarchy in a swamp. And if you think that's embarrassing, wait until you meet a king who didn't just indulge in affairs, he basically turned them into a public relations strategy. 19. Charles II of England and his illegitimate dynasty, Charles II of England, the Merry Monarch, returned to the throne in 1660 with a sense of flair, forgiveness, and unapologetic appetite. After the grim years of Puritan rule under Cromwell, the Restoration period promised laughter, art, theatre, and for Charles, a second chance at being king with as little self-restraint as possible. He kept that promise, especially the self-restraint part. Rumours about his romantic entanglements weren't rumours for long. They were practically royal press releases. Charles didn't just have mistresses, he celebrated them. He didn't deny his illegitimate children, he knighted them. Several were granted dukedoms and noble titles. Among them, the Duke of Monmouth, the Duke of Richmond, the Duke of Grafton, the Duke of St. Albans, and the Duke of Buccleuch. These weren't symbolic gestures, these were real power moves. By elevating his illegitimate sons, Charles effectively created a secondary aristocracy, a mirror image of the official one, but tethered to his personal legacy rather than any lawful marriage. It was a strange moral tightrope. On one hand, England had just restored the monarchy, and Charles presented himself as a figure of stability and unity. On the other, His open relationships with women like Nell Gwynn, Barbara Palmer, and Louise de Keroualle made the court look more like a cabaret. The irony, Charles never produced a legitimate heir. His queen, Catherine of Braganza, suffered multiple miscarriages. The man who had more acknowledged illegitimate children than any other English king couldn't secure a single legal successor. When he died in 1685, the crown passed not to a son, but to his brother James. And yet, the bloodline Charles scattered across Britain still flows through aristocratic veins today. It wasn't a hidden scandal, it was a redefinition of royal image. Charles took what would have been whispered shame in earlier centuries and turned it into political branding. It didn't make him a better king, but it did make him unforgettable. And if Charles II made philandering public, his cousin across the Channel, Louis XV of France, did one better. He industrialized it. 20. Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Bothwell marriage. Mary, Queen of Scots, lived a life that defies neat summaries. She was widowed young, returned to a tense Scotland full of religious unrest, and found herself trapped in a web of alliances, betrayals, and fatal affections. But one chapter of her life is so tangled, so controversial, and so scandalous that it has continued to divide historians for centuries. Her relationship with James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. It began as court gossip. Bothwell was a bold nobleman with ambitions and charisma. Mary, already unpopular among Protestant nobles and reeling from her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a union that quickly soured, found herself drawn into Bothwell's orbit. Then came the explosion. In February 1567, Darnley was found dead under suspicious circumstances. His house had exploded, but his body was discovered outside the ruins, strangled, not burned. The nation reeled, theories flooded in, accusations swirled, and within 3 months, Mary married Bothwell. The timing alone ensured scandal. Supporters said she was manipulated, that she was abducted, coerced. Others believed she was complicit, even enthusiastic. The famous casket letters, allegedly written by Mary to Bothwell, were used as damning evidence. Their authenticity remains debated, but their political effect was immediate. Mary's marriage to Bothwell shattered what little support she had left. The Protestant lords rebelled. She was forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son, James VI. She fled to England, hoping for refuge from her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead, she found captivity and, eventually, execution. But the central truth, her marriage to Bothwell so soon after Darnley's death, is indisputable. It fueled a narrative of betrayal, lust, and political folly. Whether Mary was a tragic pawn or a reckless queen remains the historical riddle. What makes it scandalous isn't just the speed of events, it's how calculated it all seems in retrospect. A murder, a marriage, a collapse. And if Mary's downfall was tied to her lover, the next monarch on our list suffered a far more brutal consequence, one inflicted by his own hand in a palace soaked in fear. 21. Ivan the Terrible and the death of his son. In the long, bloodied corridors of Russian history, few figures loom as menacingly as Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. He was Russia's first Tsar, a reformer, a conqueror, and a man known for unpredictable rages. But one moment in particular haunts his legacy more than any conquest: the day he killed his own son. The story was passed down as whispered rumor for centuries. Tsars were divine, after all. To imagine one murdering his heir was almost sacrilegious, but as documents accumulated, eyewitness accounts surfaced, and art began to reflect the tragedy, the truth became unavoidable. It really happened. In 1581, during an argument in the royal quarters, Ivan struck his son, also named Ivan, across the head with his scepter or staff. The blow was fatal. Accounts vary on what triggered the altercation. Some say it began with Ivan's fury at his son's pregnant wife wearing improper clothing. Others say it was a political disagreement, but all agree the Tsar lashed out. and the heir died days later. There's no cover-up here. Ivan reportedly fell into grief the moment he realized what he'd done, but the damage was permanent. Russia had lost its most competent heir. Ivan the Terrible had doomed his own line. The story became legend, immortalized in Ilya Repin's haunting painting, Ivan the Terrible and His Son, where a wild-eyed Tsar cradles his dying boy. But it was never just symbolism. It was the devastating result of uncontained royal power, unchecked by counsel, conscience, or consequence. And what followed was the time of troubles, a succession crisis, foreign invasions, famine, and chaos. Russia would pay dearly for its lost prince. Ivan's name survives in history not just because of his policies or wars, but because of a single act of rage that broke the chain of succession and shattered the illusion of royal infallibility. And if you thought that was harsh, wait until we visit his successor, another Tsar who took the crown, then turned it into a stage for paranoia, punishment, and even more royal blood. 22. Peter the Great's beard tax and brutal discipline. Peter the Great wasn't interested in tradition. He wanted transformation, rapid, relentless, and westernized. When he became Tsar of Russia in the late 17th century, he looked at the sprawling, isolationist state he inherited and decided it needed less mysticism and more modernization. That meant building a navy, reorganizing the military, founding St. Petersburg, and most famously, attacking beards. Yes, facial hair became a royal enemy. In 1698, Peter instituted a beard tax. The goal was cultural reform, align Russia with clean-shaven European norms, and erase the orthodox image of pious bearded men. Any man who wanted to keep his beard had to pay for the privilege and carry a special coin that certified his right to facial fuzz. It sounds petty, almost comedic, but it was part of a much larger pattern. Peter's reforms were rarely gentle. He didn't merely suggest change, he enforced it with military precision. Aristocrats were forced to adopt European clothing. Noble families had to send sons to study abroad. Rebellions were crushed, dissent was punished, but the most personal scandal in Peter's rule wasn't the coin or the clothing. It was the death of his own son. Alexei, Peter's heir, opposed many of his father's reforms. He preferred the old Russia, orthodox, inward-looking, resistant to Western influence. Their relationship was strained, public, and filled with tension. Eventually, Alexei was accused of plotting against his father. He was arrested, interrogated, and died in prison in 1718. The official story was illness, but many historians believe the cause was torture, or at least the brutal conditions Peter approved. Either way, the message was unmistakable. Even the Tsar's son wasn't immune to the fury of reform. Peter left behind a modernized Russia, but also a monarchy stained by fear. His legacy is both celebrated and feared. He built ships, yes, but he also broke bones, metaphorically and perhaps literally, in the name of progress. From the frostbitten empire of the Tsars, we move to Sweden, where a flamboyant king surrounded himself with drama, intrigue, and whispers of moral decay, all while claiming to purify the court. 23. Gustav III and the hypocrisies of the Swedish court. Gustav III of Sweden liked theatre, not just as a spectator, but as a practitioner. He wrote plays, staged productions, and styled his court like an opera. Every scene curated, every gesture rehearsed. But beneath the polished performances was a growing rot, scandals, favoritism, and a swirl of sexual and political rumors that eventually cost him his life. He came to power in 1771 and quickly positioned himself as an enlightened monarch. He enacted reforms, boosted the arts, and curried favor with intellectuals. Outwardly, his reign shimmered with progress, but behind the curtain it was anything but harmonious. The royal court under Gustav III was thick with patronage, favoritism cloaked in refinement. Noblemen and women jostled for his attention, and the line between political access and personal intimacy blurred. Some of his favourites were elevated to powerful positions with little merit. And then came the rumours. Whispers about Gustav's sexuality, alleged affairs, and a court riddled with contradictions began to spread. Satirical pamphlets, circulating despite censorship, mocked the hypocrisy. A king who preached moral revival while surrounding himself with scandal. It wasn't the conduct itself that enraged his critics. It was the theatrical righteousness that came with it. Gustav also centralized power aggressively, suspending parliamentary checks and ruling with increasing absolutism. His attempts to control the narrative only fanned the flames. Eventually, the tension broke. In 1792, during a masked ball, an event as ironic as it was poetic, he was shot by a disgruntled nobleman. He died days later. His assassination shocked Europe. It wasn't just a political killing, it was a rejection of a monarch whose image no longer matched reality. Gustav III had tried to rule like a philosopher king, but ended up as a cautionary character in his own melodrama. From the gilded tragedy of Sweden, we head south to Spain, where a king took his royal status to curious places, including an early secretive love for something few expected: cinema. 24. Alfonso III and the Royal Erotic Film Commissions. Alfonso XIII of Spain ruled from 1886 to 1931, a period marked by political instability, colonial loss, and a growing divide between monarchy and the people. But one of the strangest truths about Alfonso wasn't written into constitutional debates or war records. It was found in film archives. For decades, rumours swirled about the king's involvement in producing and financing early erotic films, not attending them, not collecting them, commissioning them. It sounded ridiculous at first, a cheap smear tactic aimed at undermining a monarch already unpopular for his conservative views and political bungling. And then the films were found. In the late 20th century, scholars and archivists uncovered reels stored away in Spanish film repositories, silent-era productions with curious notes, extravagant sets, and an unusual level of artistic direction. These weren't amateur projects. They were funded, scripted, and surprisingly well-made for their time. Handwritten annotations and production records linked some of these films back to royal patronage. Alfonso XIII's private circle had not only supported the productions, they had arranged for distribution among elite social clubs. The purpose wasn't profit, but pleasure, and perhaps escapism. Why would a king take such an interest in this fringe cinematic world? The answer lies somewhere between boredom and rebellion. Alfonso ruled a fractious Spain, rife with anarchists, republicans, and military flare-ups. His power was constantly under threat. The palace became less a seat of command and more a gilded cage. Within that cage, it seems, Alfonso sought distraction. His foray into underground film became a private outlet, one that contradicted his public image as a morally upright sovereign. He was eventually forced into exile in 1931 when the Second Spanish Republic was proclaimed. He died in Rome, far from Madrid, far from relevance. But the legacy of those films remains, dusty reels that reveal a king's quiet duplicity. They are not shocking in their content so much as in their existence, a reminder that royal secrets don't always come with gold and crowns. Sometimes they come with a director's cut. Next, we sail across the Atlantic into the tropical courts of Brazil and Portugal, where royal passions were so public they became scandals written into the streets. 25. Emperor Pedro I's affair with Domitila de Castro. Pedro I of Brazil, also known as Pedro IV of Portugal, wasn't just a monarch split between two thrones. He was a man split between duty and desire. His reign straddled two continents, two identities, and famously two women. His wife, Empress Maria Leopoldina, and his lover, Domitila de Castro, the Marchioness of Santos. The affair wasn't whispered. It was performed. Domitila, a noblewoman from Sao Paulo, captured Pedro's attention in the 1820s. What began as a private romance soon escalated into a full-blown royal liaison, complete with lavish gifts, titles, and open appearances at court. Unlike many monarchs who kept mistresses discreetly tucked away, Pedro elevated Domitila to the public stage. He made her a marchioness. He wrote her letters that ranged from poetic to alarmingly frank. He even arranged for her to live near the royal palace in what became known as Palacio da Marchesa. This wasn't a scandal kept behind curtains. It was an open chapter in Brazilian society, and it divided the court. Leopoldina, by contrast, remained dignified, politically astute, and increasingly marginalized. The Empress bore Pedro several children and suffered deeply, emotionally and physically, as the affair unfolded in public. Contemporary records describe the unease, ministers resigning, foreign diplomats raising eyebrows, and local clergy whispering moral warnings. The Brazilian elite, who were already unsure about Pedro's absolutist tendencies, found the open favoritism politically dangerous. And when Empress Leopoldina died in 1826, under circumstances still debated, many blamed her broken heart, whether fairly or not. Eventually, Pedro was forced to end the affair for political reasons. He married again, more strategically this time, and Domitila faded into private life. But the damage to his image lingered. His reign would later be marked by growing unrest, and he abdicated the Brazilian throne in 1831. Even in exile, Pedro carried the shadow of his affair. It wasn't the relationship itself that haunted him, it was the way he wielded it. The love became statecraft, the mistress, a court figure. From Brazil's imperial entanglements, we move to Romania, where another king chose love over caution and built a kingdom of corruption alongside his controversial companion. 26. King Carol II and Magda Lupescu's shadow reign. If Emperor Pedro flaunted his love for a mistress, King Carol II of Romania did something more daring. He built an entire regime around one. Carol was never supposed to be Romania's great reformer. He was erratic, ambitious, and perpetually torn between royal protocol and personal obsession. That obsession was Magda Lupescu, a woman of Jewish descent, divorced and charismatic, with a flair for political maneuvering. They met in the 1920s, and from that moment on, Carol was captivated. He renounced his crown at one point, only to return with Magda by his side. She wasn't just a lover, she became the shadow queen. Carol's relationship with Magda turned Romanian politics into theatre. He sidelined ministers who opposed her, installed cronies who supported her. Magda was said to be involved in court appointments, business contracts, and even policy debates. And all the while, the public looked on with a mixture of fascination and horror. What made it scandalous wasn't just the love affair, it was the brazen graft. Carol's court became a hub of corruption. The press, before it was muzzled, published exposés on backroom deals and state funds being siphoned off by a tight-knit circle, often referred to as the Camarilla. Guess who stood at the center? Magda Lupescu was more than just a romantic partner. She became the lightning rod for all public resentment toward the king. And Carol didn't care. He dissolved Parliament, created a royal dictatorship in 1938, all while continuing to fund an extravagant lifestyle in the face of national hardship. Eventually, the walls closed in. With World War II looming and internal unrest mounting, Carol abdicated in 1940 and fled Romania, with Magda, of course. They lived the rest of their lives in exile, moving through various European cities, increasingly irrelevant but still inseparable. Carol's reign is remembered as one of moral erosion, not just because of love, but because of how love was used as insulation, as power, as justification for greed. And speaking of private lives gone very public, we turn to Bulgaria, where a king's politics were as tangled as his personal reputation. and the lines between scandal and strategy blurred beyond recognition. 27. King Ferdinand I of Bulgaria and the opportunist's crown, King Ferdinand I of Bulgaria, was never quite where he was supposed to be. Born into an Austro-Hungarian princely family, he somehow wound up on the throne of a Balkan state in political turmoil. He didn't speak Bulgarian when he arrived, he didn't seem to care. But what he did have was ambition, secrecy, and scandal trailing behind him like a cape. Ferdinand ruled Bulgaria from 1887 to 1918, steering the country through independence, war, and political transformation. On paper, his reign was complex but successful. In reality, it was full of whispered rumors, backroom deals, and personal behavior that defied public morals of the time. One persistent rumor that Ferdinand's private life was complicated. He remained unmarried for years, which in the eyes of European courts raised questions. When he did marry, the union was largely political and deeply unhappy. Letters, diaries, and diplomatic correspondence from the era suggest that Ferdinand's interests lay elsewhere, and many biographers describe his relationships as unconventional. But the scandal didn't stop with romance. Ferdinand was infamous for political opportunism. He declared Bulgaria's full independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1908, then launched into a series of wars, some successful, others disastrous. His actions during the Balkan Wars and World War I were seen as reckless, driven more by ego than national interest. At home, his aloofness from the Bulgarian people and the nobility's growing resentment cast a shadow over his legitimacy. Despite his apparent intellect and diplomatic charm, Ferdinand's court became known for manipulations, shifting alliances, and an increasingly detached monarch who seemed more invested in dynastic maneuvering than in his people. Eventually, after Bulgaria's disastrous involvement in World War I, Ferdinand abdicated in favor of his son Boris and quietly left the stage. He died in exile, remembered more for what he almost accomplished than what he ever truly secured. Ferdinand's story is one of a monarch who never quite fit, too foreign for Bulgaria, too Balkan for the Austrians, too proud for compromise, and too self-serving to lead with lasting honor. Next, we travel across the Aegean to Greece, where another imported monarch would learn the hard way that a crown and a foreign name don't make you beloved, especially when your reign is remembered mostly for crisis and confusion. 28. King Otto of Greece and the imported disaster. King Otto of Greece wasn't Greek, that's already a strong start. He was Bavarian, imported like a royal accessory, handpicked by the great powers of Europe in 1832, after Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. The hope was simple: insert a neutral monarch, stabilize the region, and keep everyone politely tethered to European diplomacy. What they got was decades of dysfunction. Otto arrived in Athens at 17 with a German court, a German army, and barely a word of Greek. He ruled not by charm or cultural adaptation, but by decree, initially without a constitution, which rubbed Greeks the wrong way almost immediately. He appointed foreign advisors, imported Catholic traditions into an Orthodox country, and treated his subjects more like a school project than a sovereign people. The rumour mill turned fast. His court was accused of extravagance. His queen, Amalia, was the subject of endless gossip, and his failure to produce an heir made the whole monarchy seem not just foreign, but temporary. But it wasn't just about poor PR. Otto's real scandal was his inability to read the room, politically or economically. During his reign, Greece remained underdeveloped and riddled with debt. Otto's meddling in church affairs angered the Orthodox clergy. His centralization efforts alienated local leaders, and his refusal to genuinely listen to reformists created a pressure cooker of frustration. Things came to a head in 1862 when a military revolt and general popular exhaustion finally pushed him out. Otto and Amalia were sent packing, childless and constitutionally disgraced. They returned to Bavaria with little ceremony and a reputation for being the royals who missed the entire point of ruling. It wasn't a single scandal that undid Otto. It was the accumulation of tone-deaf decisions, foreign detachment, and an almost theatrical lack of foresight. From Greece's awkward import, we move north to Denmark, where another king allowed his court to spiral into political chaos, romantic rumors, and eventual execution. 29. Christian VII of Denmark and the Doctor's Coup. Christian VII of Denmark was crowned king in 1766. By all outward appearances, he had the royal toolkit, youth, status, and a polished lineage. But almost immediately, whispers spread through Copenhagen's corridors. Whispers about instability, unpredictability, and behavior that suggested something was deeply off. Historians now largely agree Christian suffered from significant mental illness. Symptoms included paranoia, erratic moods, and compulsive behavior. But in the 18th century, there were no clinical terms, just court gossip and a power vacuum. Into that vacuum stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's German physician. What began as medical caretaking soon became something else entirely. Struensee gained near total influence over Christian. He started issuing decrees, replacing ministers, and effectively running Denmark under the king's name. Enlightenment thinkers praised the reforms, press freedoms, legal changes, rational governance, but the Danish nobility fumed. Struensee also became entangled with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's English-born wife. The rumors of an affair, once whispered, were soon shouted. They rode together in public, shared private moments too publicly, and eventually had a child who many believed was Struensee's. The scandal was electric. A foreign doctor accused of seducing the queen and ruling the country through a mentally unfit monarch. It was a tabloid's dream, centuries before tabloids. In 1772, the backlash exploded. A palace coup was staged. Struensee was arrested and later executed. The Queen was divorced and exiled, and Christian VII, he remained king in name only for the rest of his life. The story reads like political theatre, but its tragedy was real. A country briefly flirted with reform, only to be snapped back into aristocratic control through scandal and spectacle. From Denmark's power triangle, we move to Norway, where Christian IV, the King of Denmark-Norway, juggled public morality with very private indiscretions. 30. Christian IV of Denmark-Norway and the pious hypocrite. Christian IV ruled Denmark and Norway for nearly 60 years, from the late 16th century to the mid-17th, a remarkably long reign marked by military campaigns, architectural flourishes, and the Protestant Reformation's continued fallout. But behind the image of a pious, reform-minded ruler was a man whose personal life was the very contradiction of the values he publicly enforced. He built churches, enforced Protestant orthodoxy, and railed against moral laxity. Sermons and proclamations under his rule emphasized chastity, decorum, and religious virtue. But Christian himself had a different lifestyle. The rumors were persistent and, over time, confirmed by court records. Christian maintained multiple mistresses throughout his reign. Among them, Kirsten Munk, who was officially his morganatic wife and bore him 12 children, along with Vibeke Kruse, who became his favored companion in later life. These were not secret affairs. The relationships were publicly acknowledged, their children given titles and lands. Christian's hypocrisy didn't go unnoticed. Courtiers mocked it in private, while the clergy remained awkwardly silent. The king continued to present himself as a moral authority, all while operating a parallel domestic kingdom full of unofficial consorts and carefully positioned offspring. Politically, Christian's reign was mixed. He lost disastrously in the 30 Years' War, draining Denmark's resources and weakening its influence. Domestically, however, he invested in infrastructure and the arts. He was a builder of cities, of churches, and apparently of dynastic side branches. His relationship with Kirsten Monk ended in scandal, as she was accused of infidelity and banished from court. Their children, however, remained prominent players in Danish aristocracy for generations. Christian IV's reign, like his personal life, was a blend of showy public virtue and privately sanctioned indulgence. He wanted to be remembered as a moral leader, but history remembers him as something more layered, a man whose contradictions defined an era. Next, we journey to Monaco, where a royal marriage wasn't just stormy, it was the foundation of a financial rescue plan for an entire principality. 31. Prince Rainier's parents and Monaco's financial arrangements. Before Grace Kelly and global glamour, Monaco was a sleepy, debt-ridden principality with more royal trouble than royal treasure. The man who helped turn that around, albeit indirectly, was Prince Louis II, grandfather of the current Prince Albert II, but his reign didn't unfold alone. It was defined in part by the strange strategic marriage of his daughter Charlotte and Count Pierre de Polignac, later known as Prince Pierre of Monaco. Their union wasn't a love story. It was damage control. Charlotte was the illegitimate daughter of Prince Louis II and a French cabaret singer. Her paternity was quietly confirmed, and she was later adopted as legitimate to preserve the Grimaldi line. But with legitimacy came pressure. Monaco needed a stable succession, and a stable succession needed a proper marriage. Enter Pierre, aristocratic, well-connected, and very French. He brought nobility, pedigree, and something the Monegasque court desperately needed: legitimacy by association. The match was convenient, official, and soon unbearable. Their marriage was rocky almost from the start. The couple had 2 children, including Rainier, but they separated permanently in the 1930s. Court observers described their relationship as cold and distant, and their lifestyle as increasingly separate. Behind the facade of royalty, the real scandal was the arrangement itself. The marriage had been orchestrated as part of a broader effort to stabilize the ruling family's position and reassure French authorities that Monaco would not fall into Republican or foreign hands. In return, Monaco received a kind of unofficial endorsement, protection by proximity to French aristocracy. Charlotte eventually renounced her rights to the throne in favor of her son Rainier, and Pierre faded into the background. But their union laid to the financial and political groundwork that kept Monaco afloat during its leanest years. So while the gossip focused on their failed romance, the truth was more transactional. The marriage didn't rescue the Grimaldi reputation through affection, it rescued it through diplomacy. From Monaco's delicate dynastic maneuvers, we return to Belgium again, where a different Leopold lived a life no less complicated and no less riddled with secrets. 32. Leopold Warns and the shadow of scandal. King Leopold V of Belgium is often remembered as the founder of the modern Belgian monarchy, steady, diplomatic, and cautious. But beneath that veneer of Victorian prudence was a personal life tangled with long-standing rumours, private affairs, and financial dealings that even 19th-century diplomats found hard to ignore. Leopold came to the throne in 1831 after declining the crowns of both Greece and Mexico, a man who seemed more interested in monarchy as a negotiation than a calling. Once installed in Belgium, he cultivated an image of refined European leadership. But behind the image was a trail of private letters, ambiguous relationships, and questionable transactions that painted a more complicated picture. One of the longest-running rumors involved Leopold's intimate friendships with various noble women, relationships that were often publicly platonic but privately suspect. Correspondence between the king and certain women revealed affection that, while never outright explicit, suggested something more than courtly friendship. He also maintained financial interests across Europe, with holdings in railways, land deals, and political investments. Some of these ventures intersected with his role as king in ways that raised eyebrows. Though no criminality was ever proven, diplomatic dispatches from the time make clear that many European courts viewed Leopold's private affairs, both romantic and financial, as unusually entangled with state matters. Even Queen Victoria, his niece, noted his complexities. She adored him, referred to him as Uncle Leopold, and often sought his counsel. But even she made subtle references to his charming entanglements. The phrase may have been diplomatic, but it wasn't exactly exoneration. For all his diplomatic skill, Leopold was seen, especially in private, as a monarch who blurred the lines between statecraft and self-interest. His public face was measured and reserved, his private dealings less so. He died in 1865 with his legacy intact, officially, but the archived letters, carefully phrased dispatches, and well-documented affairs left behind a very different kind of record. Now, from tangled Belgian dynasties to one of history's most infamous royal bodies, we arrive at a king whose physical presence symbolized an entire empire's genetic unraveling. 33. Charles II of Spain and the Habsburg collapse. Charles II of Spain wasn't just the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, he was the dynasty's final warning. Born in 1661, after generations of intermarriage among Europe's royals, Charles was the unfortunate product of centuries of political inbreeding. And for decades, his condition was explained away in court whispers and foreign satire. But the truth was more serious than rumour. Charles was severely disabled, infertile, and unable to govern effectively, both physically and politically. The rumours weren't merely gossipy, they were systemic. European envoys described him as slow, sickly, and visibly unwell. His jaw was so pronounced, thanks to generations of Habsburg chin exaggeration, that he reportedly struggled to chew and speak clearly. His intellect was limited, his moods erratic, and his court dominated by factions and opportunists. For a long time, Spanish officials treated these issues as unmentionable. The monarch was divine, therefore perfect. But foreign observers weren't so restrained. Their reports painted a tragic figure surrounded by superstition, manipulative advisors, and a nation in decline. Charles never produced an heir. His 2 marriages were childless, and his health deteriorated in public view. Desperate for a solution, some courtiers believed he was cursed. Exorcisms were attempted, prayers were offered, all while rival European powers waited to see who would claim Spain once Charles died. And when he did die, in 1700, it triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive bloody struggle that reshaped European politics. His death marked not just the end of a reign, but the collapse of a genetic experiment gone too far. Today, Charles II is often viewed as a symbol of dynastic excess, an entire royal house reduced to a single suffering individual. His medical records and autopsy reports, later studied by historians and scientists, confirmed what had once been court gossip. The rumours about Charles weren't exaggerated. If anything, they were understated. From the end of the Spanish Habsburgs, we turn to Ethiopia, where another royal didn't collapse under infirmity, but combusted under pressure, leaving a legacy of rebellion, fire, and one final dramatic end. 34. Emperor Tewodros II and the fall at Magdala. In the mid-19th century, Ethiopia was fractured, split between rival nobles, regional kings, and religious factions. Into that chaos strode Tewodros II, a former bandit-turned-emperor who believed destiny had chosen him to unite the empire. And for a time, it looked like he might pull it off. Tewodros was a reformer. He built roads, centralized power, and tried to modernize Ethiopia's military. But his leadership style, aggressive, impatient, and fueled by deep suspicion. When people questioned his authority, he didn't negotiate, he punished. And when he felt disrespected, the consequences spiraled. One of his most infamous acts stemmed from diplomatic frustration. Tewodros wrote to Queen Victoria requesting military experts and technological assistance. When the British delayed their response or simply ignored it, depending on the source, he took hostages. British officials and missionaries were imprisoned, triggering international outcry. The whispers started there. Was this a king with a vision, or a ruler unraveling in isolation? His court became a mix of reverence and fear. Even his closest allies saw his temper as unpredictable. He grew increasingly paranoid, surrounded by enemies real and imagined. In 1868, Britain responded. A massive military expedition marched to Magdala, Tewodros's mountain fortress. Rather than surrender or negotiate, he watched as his position collapsed. Then, in a final defiant act, he took his own life. For decades, stories swirled about the emperor's last stand. Some viewed it as heroic, others as tragic. But the truth is stranger than either version. Tewodros didn't just fall, he imploded. His ambitions were massive, his reforms real, but his inability to compromise doomed him. His legacy remains fiercely debated in Ethiopia. Some remember him as a nationalist hero, others recall the fear he instilled. And that's the paradox. A ruler who tried to forge unity but couldn't master his own rage. From the scorched rock of Magdala, we turn east to Southeast Asia, where palace intrigue took a quieter, colder form in the ruthless purges of a royal court that didn't forgive mistakes. 35. King Narasuan and the ruthless court politics of Ayutthaya. In the late 16th century, Thailand, then the kingdom of Ayutthaya, was a rising regional power, constantly navigating between independence and domination by Burma. At the center of that tension was King Narasuan, one of Thailand's most celebrated warrior kings. But behind the battlefield, glory was a royal court teeming with purges, power plays, and political suspicion. Narasuan is remembered for his military triumphs, especially the legendary elephant duel in which he defeated the Burmese crown prince. His heroism became folklore, statues of him dot the Thai landscape, and his name is still evoked as a symbol of strength and patriotism. But legends tend to gloss over the sharp edges of leadership, and Narasuan's court was not a place of mercy. It was a crucible of suspicion. Historical chronicles describe a pattern of ruthlessness aimed not at enemies abroad, but at rivals within. Members of the nobility were demoted, imprisoned, or quietly eliminated if they were suspected of disloyalty or simply fell out of favor. The royal court, during Narasuan's rule, was as much about internal control as external defense. Some scholars argue these purges were necessary. The kingdom was unstable, surrounded by threats, and riddled with factionalism. Others say they were excessive, driven by paranoia and the trauma of Narasuan's youth, having been held hostage in Burma as a child. The whispers of violence in Ayutthaya's inner circle weren't mere legend. Chronicles like the Royal Chronicles of Ayutthaya contain passages describing abrupt executions, political disappearances, and family betrayals. While embellished by time, these accounts reveal a reign where consolidation of power came at a cost. What makes Narasuan's story so compelling is its contrast. The national hero abroad, the feared monarch at home. The same man who liberated his people may have ruled them with an iron grip. From Southeast Asia's deadly royal chessboard, we shift to the Indian subcontinent, where one princely ruler made history not with bloodshed but with a lavish canine celebration so over the top it's still cited today. 36. Nawab Mahabat Khan III and the royal dog wedding. In the annals of royal excess, few events are as jaw-droppingly surreal as the 1892 wedding of two dogs. Yes, dogs, staged by Mahabat Khan III, the Nawab of Junagadh, a princely state in British India. It was less a wedding and more a spectacle. A royal performance of absurdity that baffled even the British officials, who were usually quite numb to princely eccentricities. The Nawab loved animals deeply. His menagerie reportedly included hundreds of rare dogs, birds, and exotic creatures. But it was the wedding of his favorite dog to a carefully chosen canine consort that made international headlines. The ceremony was elaborate. Invitations were sent. The procession was grand. The groom was dressed in silk. The bride wore jewelry. British dignitaries were invited, not out of diplomatic necessity, but seemingly for theatrical effect. According to reports, the event cost more than what many of his subjects earned in a year. Locals were perplexed. The British were amused, then horrified. A Times of India article at the time described it as a moment of surreal detachment between ruler and ruled. Was it just a rich man having fun? Maybe, but many saw it as a symbol of disconnection. Mahabat Khan ruled over a population that faced economic hardship, yet spent lavishly on a canine fantasy. It wasn't about affection, it was about optics. This was a display of power that said, I can do this and no one can stop me. The British didn't intervene. Why would they? The spectacle served their narrative, the image of Eastern rulers as indulgent, unserious, and in need of colonial oversight. Mahabat Khan's reputation never quite recovered. The dog wedding was cited in government memos, colonial records, and newspapers for decades afterward. It was no longer a rumor. It was a documented truth that blurred the line between affection and absurdity. From one display of royal detachment, we head to another court in India, where one monarch's obsession with treasure turned his palaces into literal vaults, while his people lived outside in scarcity. 37. The Nizam of Hyderabad and the hoarded wealth. In the grand catalogue of royal indulgence, few stories are as bizarrely lopsided as that of the Nizam of Hyderabad. The princely state was the richest in India, its ruler among the wealthiest men in the world, at one point allegedly richer than the British monarch himself, and yet his city was riddled with poverty. His palace, stuffed with literal piles of jewels. The Nizam in question, Mir Osman Ali Khan, the last ruling Nizam before Hyderabad's annexation into India, was a man of contrasts. He dressed modestly, chewed dry bread, and slept on a metal cot. But behind the austerity was a near-obsessive hoarding of unimaginable wealth. In the palatial chambers of his royal compound, sacks of diamonds were stored in vaults, emeralds were kept in tins, loose rubies lined desk drawers, gold ingots stacked beside ledgers. This wasn't state wealth, this was personal treasure, collected over generations, left untouched while the people outside his palace struggled with basic needs. British colonial records and later Indian accounts confirmed what had long been whispered. The Nizam was hoarding enough treasure to fund an army, a nation, or several lifetimes of luxury. Instead, it mostly sat, gathering dust. Some reports claimed the Nizam used a £2 million diamond as a paperweight. Despite this, he wasn't a flamboyant ruler. There were no royal dog weddings, no masquerade balls. His extravagance was quiet, passive, almost bureaucratic, but it was no less scandalous. Hyderabad was a sprawling state with deep inequality. Roads were poor, literacy low, and infrastructure uneven. The Nizam, an absolute monarch, had the means to change it. But he didn't. His hoarded gems became a metaphor for a feudal system incapable of self-reform. When India integrated Hyderabad in 1948, much of the royal treasury was sealed. Legal battles over ownership of the treasure persist to this day. What's indisputable is that the wealth was real, excessive, and ultimately wasted on silence. From Hyderabad's dusty treasure vaults, we travel to Mysore, where another Indian ruler shocked foreign envoys with regal displays, religious fervor, and wartime decisions that became legend. 38. Tipu Sultan and the Court of Shocked Europeans. Tipu Sultan of Mysore wasn't just a king, he was a lightning bolt in silk robes. European visitors to his court came expecting exotic charm. What they got was confrontation. Tipu was a fierce opponent of British expansion, a skilled military strategist, and a devout ruler whose court combined strict governance with intense spectacle. What unsettled foreign envoys most wasn't just his resistance, it was how he ruled. His court was rich with rituals that felt alien to outsiders, with an air of militant religiosity and centralized control that shocked those used to more pliable Indian princely states. The British, in particular, painted Tipu as a tyrant. Some of this was propaganda, but much of it stemmed from real events: forced religious conversions during wartime, harsh treatment of defeated enemies, and a court culture that rejected British diplomatic norms. European accounts describe his palace as both beautiful and intimidating, filled with tiger motifs, his symbol of strength, elaborate mechanical toys that mocked the British, and soldiers trained to kill, not entertain. The famous Tipu's tiger, an automaton of a tiger mauling a European soldier, was considered grotesque by British sensibilities, but to Tipu it was satire carved in wood. His administration was unusually modern for the time. He introduced a new currency, encouraged industry, and modernized the military with French help. Yet his rule also saw repression, particularly in the form of forced relocations and punishments for dissent. To his supporters, Tipu was a freedom fighter. To his enemies, a despot. To British officials, he was a problem who refused to behave. After 4 wars with the British East India Company, Tipu was killed in 1799 during the fall of Srirangapatna. His death ended one of the last serious threats to British supremacy in southern India. But the memory of his court lingered, not just for its politics, but for its uncanny mix of sophistication and terror. Now we climb higher into the Himalayas, where royal power took a different form, absolute, inherited, and quietly decadent, hidden in the shadow of the British Raj. 39. The Rana dynasty of Nepal and their hidden harems. For over a century, Nepal was ruled not by kings, but by hereditary prime ministers, members of the powerful Rana dynasty, who turned the monarchy into a decorative relic and governed with nearly unchecked authority. From 1846 to 1951, the Ranas controlled everything: the army, the treasury, and the foreign policy. The king, a figurehead, cloaked in ceremony. The real power sat behind ornate doors guarded by soldiers, silence, and tradition. The Ranas modelled their regime on European aristocracy, complete with opulent palaces, imported furnishings, and a court culture that mixed Hindu conservatism with Victorian grandeur. But behind the chandeliers and gilded walls was something far less respectable: private harems, secret tunnels, and stockpiled wealth that drew quiet outrage even among British diplomats. The rumours were endless. Ranas kept entire compounds of consorts. British envoys wrote reports describing excessive indulgences and palatial quarters for concubines. These weren't whispers from rivals, they were observations from partners who still found the decadence hard to excuse. And then there was the money. The Ranas lived like emperors, while much of Nepal remained rural and underdeveloped. Their palaces were stuffed with Persian carpets, Belgian mirrors, and silver-plated everything. Public services lagged, but the private quarters of Rana leaders grew increasingly elaborate. Despite this, the Ranas portrayed themselves as reformers. They allowed limited education, dabbled in infrastructure, and styled themselves as protectors of tradition. But their absolute grip on power ensured that any critique remained theoretical. The dynasty's downfall came not through revolution, but through internal decay and political shift. In 1951, King Tribhuvan, once sidelined by the Ranas, aligned with democratic forces to reclaim real power. The Ranas were pushed out of office, and Nepal took its first steps toward constitutional monarchy. What remains today are the ruins of those palaces, haunted not by ghosts, but by legacy. The silent courtyards, the sprawling harems, and the forgotten archives tell a simple truth. Power, when left unchecked, tends to forget what it's supposed to serve. Next, we follow a camera flash across borders to Persia, where a Shah's obsession with photography revealed more than art. It revealed a pattern of control dressed up as personal preference. 40. Nasr al-Din Shah and the photographic harem. Nasr al-Din Shah of Persia, who ruled from 1848 to 1896, wasn't just a monarch, he was an early adopter with a camera and a harem, and no clear boundaries between the two. Obsessed with modernization, Western technology, and himself, the Qajar Shah fell in love with photography not just as an art form, but as a tool for indulgence and control. Among his many portraits and landscapes, there was a favorite subject, his harem. The Persian royal harem was vast, dozens of women, each carefully ranked and regulated within a strictly enforced hierarchy. For centuries, this world remained hidden from public view, but Nasr al-Din changed that in a way. He began photographing his wives and concubines himself, building an enormous private archive of images that blurred the lines between intimacy, documentation, and control. The portraits weren't lurid, they were staged, highly stylized, often modest by modern standards, but unmistakably personal. These were not just images of women, they were visual extensions of royal authority. The harem wasn't just a private domain, it became a curated visual collection. For decades, these photos were locked away. Rumors about their existence persisted, dismissed by some as Orientalist fantasy. But then, gradually, the archives surfaced. Historians, archivists, and museums began recovering and publishing the photographs. The rumors were real. What shocked modern audiences wasn't the existence of the images, but the way they reframed royal privacy as performance. The women, some stern, some smiling, many adorned in heavy fabrics, stared back at the camera with a quiet dignity. Yet behind every frame was the Shah himself, orchestrating the gaze. Nasr al-Din's interest in photography was part of his larger fascination with European culture. He toured Europe, met Queen Victoria, and imported new technologies. But he remained fundamentally autocratic, and his use of photography only deepened his control over palace life. He was assassinated in 1896 by a political dissident. But his images live on, reshaping how we understand royal power, not through war or wealth, but through the quiet command of the lens. From private photographs to public paranoia, we now return to the Ottoman Empire, where another ruler didn't need a camera to keep tabs. He had spies, thousands of them. 41. Sultan Abdulhamid II and the Empire of Surveillance. Sultan Abdulhamid II ruled the Ottoman Empire from 1876 to 1909, a time of decline, reform, rebellion, and increasing fear. Officially, he was the Caliph of Islam and protector of a vast, crumbling empire. Unofficially, he was known for something else entirely, a surveillance network so vast and intrusive that it turned Istanbul into a city of whispers. The rumors were everywhere, friends turning on friends, letters intercepted, conversations repeated in unexpected places. And as it turned out, the rumors weren't rumors at all. Abdulhamid really did run one of the most obsessive intelligence operations of any 19th century monarch. He built an elaborate spy network known as the Hafiye Teşkilatı, or Domestic Intelligence Service. Agents monitored political dissidents, religious groups, foreign diplomats, and even other members of the royal family. Reports flowed daily into Yildiz Palace, where the Sultan reviewed dossiers with a pen in one hand and suspicion in the other. He censored newspapers, banned foreign literature, and kept an especially sharp eye on students and intellectuals. Libraries were combed for subversive material. Plays were rewritten. Even the mention of certain ideas, freedom, republicanism, decentralization, could land someone in prison, or worse. This wasn't paranoia without reason. The empire was fragile. Nationalist uprisings in the Balkans, economic crises, and rising European interference made Abdulhamid feel like a king under siege, and he responded accordingly. Still, his obsession with control created its own instability. While he was shoring up palace defenses, underground opposition movements flourished. His censorship gave rise to clandestine newspapers, smuggled in from abroad. His distrust alienated reformers who might have otherwise helped the empire modernize. By the early 20th century, opposition crystallized into revolution. In 1908, the Young Turks, a group of reformist military officers and bureaucrats, forced Abdulhamid to restore the constitution he had suspended decades earlier. By 1909, he was deposed and sent into exile. He lived out his final years quietly in Thessaloniki, reportedly still convinced that plots surrounded him. Abdulhamid's reign is remembered not just for repression, but for proving a strange truth. The more a monarch tries to see everything, the more blind he becomes to what matters. From the imperial shadows of Istanbul, we head to the Arabian Peninsula, where one founder king built a kingdom on marriage alliances so vast, his family tree became a national infrastructure. 42. Ibn Saud and the strategic marriages. When Abdulaziz ibn Saud unified the tribes of the Arabian Peninsula into modern-day Saudi Arabia in the early 20th century, he didn't just conquer territory, he married it, literally. Ibn Saud was a statesman, warrior, and master strategist, and one of his key tools wasn't just the sword or diplomacy, it was polygyny. By the time of his death in 1953, he had reportedly married over 20 women and fathered at least 45 sons, with hundreds of grandchildren following close behind. But unlike rulers who married for personal pleasure, Ibn Saud used marriage as a political tactic. Each wife came from a powerful tribe or family. By wedding into various factions, he created a web of alliances that solidified his authority and quieted dissent. Tribal loyalty in Arabia was everything. Ibn Saud understood that blood ties were stronger than treaties. His marriages turned potential enemies into in-laws and gave the House of Saud unprecedented reach across the desert. This practice wasn't hidden. It was part of the state-building project. Foreign diplomats and regional rivals commented on it often, with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Was it brilliance or merely control, dressed as tradition? His sons were appointed to key roles: governors, ministers, commanders, embedding the royal family across every layer of government. And while the marriages were consensual and traditional in the local context, the sheer scale became a topic of international curiosity. The result? A monarchy that wasn't just a political institution, it was a sprawling family business. One built not only on oil and religion, but on a network of genetic alliances. Today, the legacy of Ibn Saud's marriages continues. Many current Saudi royals are his direct descendants. The power structure he created wasn't temporary, it became the framework of the kingdom. So, yes, the rumors were true. Ibn Saud's harem wasn't a relic of the past. It was a foundation stone for the present. Next, we move west to North Africa, where another ruler, faced with crisis, didn't build a dynasty. He simply ran off with the national treasure. 43. Sultan Abdulhafid and the flight with the treasury. In 1912, Morocco was teetering on the edge of colonial collapse. Foreign influence was rising, protests were spreading, and Sultan Abdulhafid, once hailed as a nationalist hope, was growing increasingly unpopular. So, when the time came for him to abdicate, he didn't just step down quietly. He packed a royal fortune and left. The event was widely rumored in its day. Abdulhafid, after signing the Treaty of Fez, which officially made Morocco a French protectorate, was said to have taken vast amounts of gold, jewels, and state funds with him. Some described it as a bribe, others as looting. Either way, it was a scandal. The Treaty of Fez had already enraged Moroccans. It effectively surrendered national sovereignty. Abdul Hafid, who had once positioned himself as the anti-colonial alternative to his brother, was now handing the keys to the French, and as the ink dried, he began preparing for a rather lavish retirement. Foreign archives confirm what Moroccan citizens long suspected. Large transfers of funds were arranged as part of the abdication package. The former sultan was granted a pension and allowed to leave with personal assets that blurred the line between private wealth and public resources. Where did he go? First to Tangier, then eventually to France, where he lived in comfortable exile. His lifestyle there, according to diplomatic correspondence, didn't exactly scream austerity. And while Morocco was handed over to foreign control, Abdul Hafid became something else entirely, a former ruler who sold his throne and packed the receipts. The mystery lies not in whether he took the treasure, he did, but in how casually it was accepted. The French had little incentive to question the optics. For them, the deal secured control. For Abdul Hafid, it secured comfort. Today, he's remembered not as a national hero or a great reformer, but as a man whose reign ended with a suitcase full of silver and a first-class ticket to irrelevance. From Morocco's vanished vaults, we move south to the Zulu kingdom, where royal mourning once escalated into a brutal campaign that left even early chroniclers horrified. 44. Shaka Zulu and the vengeful mourning. Shaka Zulu remains one of the most iconic and controversial figures in African history. A military genius, empire builder, and political innovator, he transformed the Zulu kingdom from a small chieftaincy into a regional powerhouse. But with that transformation came a reign marked by ruthlessness, and one particular event still echoes with dread: the aftermath of his mother's death. Queen Nandi, Shaka's beloved mother, died in 1827. Her passing broke something inside the king. He wasn't just devastated, he was unhinged. In Zulu tradition, mourning was sacred, but what followed under Shaka became something else entirely. Chroniclers, both Zulu oral historians and early European visitors, recorded a period of mourning so extreme it turned into a state crisis. Agricultural work was suspended. Cows were slaughtered en masse, not for food, but as a ritual expression of grief. Women who became pregnant were executed. Men who didn't show enough sorrow faced harsh punishments. Some of these accounts were once dismissed as exaggerated colonial narratives. But over time, cross-referenced sources, Zulu oral tradition, missionary writings and archaeological studies have confirmed that something catastrophic happened. The mourning period disrupted the economy. Crops failed, political rivals grew restless, and Shaka's own leadership came into question. What drove him? Grief, certainly, but also a kind of theatrical statecraft. Shaka had always ruled through spectacle. Grand parades, fierce military drills, strict discipline. His mourning for Nandi became the ultimate political performance, one meant to show absolute control, even in personal despair. But it backfired. His brothers, Dingaan and Mokhlangana, saw the chaos as opportunity. In 1828, just a year after Nandi's death, they assassinated him. Today, Shaka is remembered in radically different ways. In South African history, he's both a symbol of unity and a cautionary tale of power unbound. The mourning of his mother, once dismissed as a dramatic footnote, now stands as a pivotal moment in the unravelling of a legendary reign. From ritual slaughter to royal splurging, our next stop is in southern Africa's modern monarchies, where a fleet of luxury cars and palaces sparked outrage in nations struggling with poverty. 45. The extravagance of Lesotho and Eswatini's monarchies. Tucked between craggy mountains and South African borders, the kingdoms of Lesotho and Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, are two of the world's few remaining absolute monarchies. Their rulers, however, have faced growing criticism, not for ancient sins, but for very modern indulgences. The pattern is familiar. Small country, struggling economy, and a royal court living like it belongs to a petrostate. In Lesotho, King Letsie III has largely maintained a low profile, but even his symbolic monarchy hasn't escaped scandal. Reports over the years have revealed that significant government funds were spent on royal travel, luxury cars, and state ceremonies, often while the general population faced unemployment, drought, and political unrest. But the sharper criticism has been levelled at Eswatini under King Mswati III. Ruling since 1986, he has become a lightning rod for accusations of royal excess. His fleet of luxury cars, including Maybachs and Rolls-Royces, has made headlines. So has his private jet. All this in a country where many citizens live below the poverty line and access to healthcare and education remains limited. The King's birthday parties, held in stadiums and featuring performances by international artists, have drawn particular ire. Critics say the money spent on these events could easily fund hospitals or schools. Instead, it funds royal pageantry, presented as national pride, received by many as tone-deaf indulgence. Pro-democracy activists and human rights groups have documented these extravagances for years, calling for reform, transparency, and a more representative system. Some protests have turned violent, others have been quietly silenced. The royal governments, for their part, defend their spending as tradition. They argue that monarchy is part of cultural identity and national unity. But as inequality grows, so does public scrutiny. These aren't the scandals of ancient times, they're live debates in real time. And the rumours of palace luxury? They've been confirmed by satellite photos, leaked budgets, and luxury car registries. Next, we head even farther across the Pacific to a Polynesian kingdom where the 1990s brought not gold, but passports. Lots of them for sale. 46. Tonga and the royal passport sales. In the 1990s, the Kingdom of Tonga, a Pacific archipelago known for its deep-rooted monarchy and rich Polynesian traditions, became the unlikely epicenter of a diplomatic scandal that sounded like something out of a spy novel: royalty-sanctioned passport sales. Tonga had long operated under an absolute monarchy, with King Taufa'ahau Tupu IV holding wide-ranging powers over domestic affairs. His reign was known for both traditionalist values and efforts to modernize a struggling economy. But economic development took a strange turn when the government began selling Tongan passports to foreign nationals, quietly and then not so quietly. The idea was simple. In exchange for a fee, typically tens of thousands of US dollars, foreign buyers could obtain Tongan citizenship. The money, according to officials, would help finance development projects and bring much-needed cash into the country. But this wasn't a straightforward immigration program. It was a workaround, a sovereignty-for-sale operation in miniature. Investigations later showed that some passports ended up in the hands of criminals, fugitives, and shady businessmen, individuals looking to buy a new identity or a strategic travel document. Several reports connected the sales to international financial scams and questionable banking operations. The scheme wasn't limited to a few rogue officials. Members of the royal family were involved in approving, promoting, and allegedly profiting from the program. At its height, Tonga was even considering issuing diplomatic passports to wealthy foreign nationals, granting privileges far beyond ordinary citizenship. The backlash was swift. Foreign governments began questioning the legitimacy of Tongan passports. International organizations raised red flags, and the Tongan public, dealing with stagnant wages and limited infrastructure, started to wonder why their national identity was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Eventually, the government was pressured to shut down the program. Laws were rewritten. Some officials were quietly removed, but the damage to the monarchy's reputation lingered. The passport scandal revealed not just financial desperation, but a deeper vulnerability. How a centuries-old monarchy tried to navigate modern economics and ended up in an international mess. From island kingdoms and sold identities, we travel to the Pacific's other royal outpost, where one king bet the monarchy's future on global tours, gambling and pageantry, and came up short. 47. King Kalakaua of Hawaii and the costly world tour. In the late 19th century, King David Kalakaua of Hawaii was a monarch caught between eras. Enthroned in a kingdom facing growing foreign pressure, Kalakaua responded not by retreating into isolation, but by stepping onto the global stage, quite literally. In 1881, he became the first reigning monarch to circumnavigate the globe. On the surface, it was a triumph. The king visited Japan, Siam, Thailand, India, Egypt, Europe, and the United States, presenting himself as a sovereign equal among the crowned heads of the world. The tour was a bold move for a small island kingdom and a savvy attempt at international diplomacy. But behind the ceremonial receptions and formal photographs was a much messier reality. The trip was expensive, staggeringly so. Kalakaua's court borrowed heavily to fund it, justifying the cost as necessary to elevate Hawaii's standing. Yet many of the alliances and trade agreements he hoped to forge never materialized. He returned with few tangible gains and a rapidly swelling debt. This would have been bad enough on its own, but Kalakaua's financial decisions didn't stop with diplomacy. He had a well-known affinity for luxury and entertainment. The royal palace, Iolani, was outfitted with electric lighting and opulent furnishings, making it one of the most technologically advanced buildings in the world at the time, but also a symbol of excessive spending. His gambling habits, long rumored, added another layer. Foreign newspapers and local opponents accused him of squandering public funds on games of chance and lavish personal indulgences. Whether fully accurate or politically exaggerated, the accusations stuck. Critics within Hawaii, especially among the growing population of American and European settlers, began to view the king not as a global visionary, but as fiscally irresponsible and politically naive. By the end of his reign, Kalakaua's popularity had sharply declined. He was forced to sign the 1887 Bayonet Constitution, stripping the monarchy of much of its power. He died just a few years later while on a trip to San Francisco. His world tour became a cautionary tale. A royal journey meant to elevate Hawaii instead underscored its vulnerability. Next, we travel to Mexico, where a European emperor tried to rule an empire not his own, with foreign money and borrowed authority, until reality finally closed in. 48. Emperor Maximilian and the Mirage of Mexican Royalty. In 1864, Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian of Austria arrived in Mexico to claim a throne that was never truly his. Backed by French Emperor Napoleon III and conservative Mexican monarchists, Maximilian was installed as emperor during a deeply divided period in Mexico's history. The Republic had been suspended. The empire was in. On paper, it looked regal. Maximilian and his wife Carlotta set up court at Chapultepec Castle, embraced liberal-sounding reforms, and posed for portraits that portrayed them as benevolent modernizers. But the reality was a web of contradictions. Maximilian was a European idealist ruling a land in turmoil. His support came largely from foreign troops and a small domestic elite. His power was built on loans from France and support from European monarchies, not from Mexican legitimacy. The scandal wasn't in any one act, it was in the entire enterprise. An empire imposed from the outside, propped up by foreign money and sold as salvation. Maximilian implemented reforms, some progressive, like land redistribution and indigenous rights, but he lacked the military and political strength to enforce them. Meanwhile, Republican forces under Benito Juárez never stopped resisting. The US, fresh from its civil war, began pressuring France to withdraw. Napoleon III, realizing the empire was unsustainable, pulled his troops out in 1866. Maximilian was offered a chance to escape. He refused, believing he had a duty to the Mexican people, or perhaps unwilling to admit defeat. He was captured in 1867, tried by a military court, and executed by firing squad. The empire had lasted 3 years. Today, Maximilian's reign is remembered not for tyranny or corruption, but for hubris. He was a well-meaning outsider who mistook foreign glamour for legitimacy. His court, funded by loans and borrowed time, wasn't a scandal of personal immorality, but of strategic blindness. And while he died with composure, the scandal lingered that a European prince could parachute into a divided country and expect to rule with portraits, policies, and palace dances. From Mexico's imperial mirage, we now head to Brazil again, this time to its second emperor, whose royal court maintained a polite silence over marital fractures that were plain to see. 49. Emperor Pedro II of Brazil and the quiet marital estrangement. Pedro II of Brazil is often remembered as one of the more thoughtful and principled monarchs of the 19th century. He spoke multiple languages, corresponded with scientists and philosophers, and led Brazil through a period of relative stability and progress. But while his public life was carefully composed, his private life told a quieter, more complicated story, particularly his long and largely estranged marriage to Empress Teresa Cristina. Their union began, like many royal marriages, strategic, not romantic. Teresa Cristina of the Two Sicilies was chosen for her respectable lineage and diplomatic usefulness. But from the start, there was little chemistry. Pedro reportedly found her physically unattractive, and their relationship was marked more by formality than affection. Despite producing 4 children, the imperial couple lived increasingly separate lives. Teresa Cristina took on religious and charitable duties, becoming beloved for her humility and kindness. Pedro, meanwhile, turned to intellectual companions and a string of discreet emotional affairs, most famously with the French opera singer Madame Giuditta Pasta, and later, possibly, with poet Nicia Floresta. None of these relationships erupted into public scandal. This was Brazil, not the French court, and Pedro was careful. His public image was that of the philosopher king, and he maintained a quiet dignity even in his emotional diversions. But behind the polite silence was a deep personal distance between the emperor and empress, well known within court circles. The irony is that both were decent people, just not together. Letters and diaries from the era reflect mutual respect, even fondness, but never passion. In the empire's official narrative, they remained a united couple. In private, they occupied parallel palaces of emotional solitude. Their marriage didn't bring down the monarchy, but it symbolized something deeper, a court built on appearances, a royal household where duty overrode desire and where emotional truth was always the last thing allowed to surface. And now we pivot from one monarch who kept things discreet to another who put everything out in the open, legitimizing his illegitimate children and reshaping nobility with names that were never meant to be royal. 50. Charles II of England and the public acknowledgement of illegitimacy. Charles II didn't invent royal infidelity, but he certainly gave it a brand. Known as the Merry Monarch, his reign marked the return of the English monarchy after the Cromwellian interregnum. He brought back the theatre, the arts, and a kind of rakish swagger that made his court the gossip capital of Europe. But Charles wasn't just indulgent, he was deliberate. He didn't just have mistresses, he institutionalized them, and most notably, he didn't hide his illegitimate children, he elevated them. Among the most famous were James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, Charles Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, and Charles Beauclerk, Duke of St. Albans. These were not anonymous offspring shuffled off to private estates. They were given titles, lands, and roles in court. It was a scandal not because they existed, but because Charles embraced them so openly. He had no legitimate heirs with his wife, Catherine of Braganza. Despite multiple pregnancies, none produced a surviving child. So while the monarchy waited for a miracle that never came, Charles built an alternative royal ecosystem, populated by the children of actresses, courtiers, and noble mistresses. The public watched with a mix of fascination and moral panic. Some saw it as charming, a king too human to be restrained. Others saw it as a breakdown of royal decorum, a blurring of the lines between crown and chaos. Parliament tolerated it, but not without comment. The fear was always that one of these illegitimate sons might claim the throne. That fear nearly came true. Charles's eldest, the Duke of Monmouth, attempted to seize power after Charles's death, arguing his father had married his mother in secret. The rebellion failed and Monmouth was executed, but the crisis underscored the danger of a royal court where bloodlines became performance. Charles's decision to publicly elevate his illegitimate children reshaped English aristocracy. Many of their descendants still hold titles today, but the core scandal wasn't about morality. It was about monarchy itself. What happens when a king decides that legitimacy is flexible? When the royal line becomes a matter of preference instead of law? From Charles's dynastic improv, we head back to France, where another Sun King didn't just entertain mistresses. He essentially built an alternate royal lineage in full view of Versailles. 51. Louis XIV and the institutionalized mistress system. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was perhaps the most image-obsessed monarch in European history. His court at Versailles was a machine of spectacle, designed to project order, divinity, and absolute control. But even within this choreographed perfection, personal scandal flourished in full view. Louis didn't hide his mistresses. He gave them rooms, titles, power. Madame de Montespan was perhaps the most famous. Intelligent, sharp-tongued, and ambitious. She bore him 7 children. While officially outside the line of succession, these children were legitimized and given noble ranks. One became the Duke of Maine, another the Count of Toulouse, and all of it was formalized, as if the king's personal preferences had become a secondary institution of state. When Montespan fell from favor after being implicated in the infamous Affair of the Poisons, a scandal that nearly shook Versailles, she was replaced by Madame de Maintenon, a more devout and discreet consort whom Louis is believed to have secretly married after the death of his queen. This rotation of power through the bedroom wasn't hidden from public view. It was embedded into the machinery of Versailles. The king's mistresses weren't distractions, they were players. They influenced policy, managed court alliances, and received official audiences. What made this all scandalous wasn't the presence of mistresses. That was standard fare for monarchs. It was the way Louis formalized them. Children born of these unions were legitimized, educated, and absorbed into the nobility. The distinction between royal and not quite royal became blurred by decree. This reshaping of royal norms didn't go unnoticed. Foreign courts observed it with a mix of fascination and horror. Versailles, the model of absolutist splendor, was also the stage for a kind of dynastic theater where the rules were bent to suit the leading man. Louis's legitimized children would go on to form new aristocratic branches, intertwining with other noble houses and leaving a legacy that complicated France's already delicate balance between monarchy and bloodline. From this glittering tapestry of staged romance, we cross the channel once more to a Scottish-English king whose private relationships with male favourites became one of the most whispered and well-documented royal rumours to prove embarrassingly, unquestionably true. 52. James VI and the royal favourites James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, was a king fluent in political union, biblical translation, and poetic flattery. But what really got the nobility whispering wasn't his theological interests or literary flair, it was his favourites. And by favourites, we don't just mean influential courtiers. We mean young men, often strikingly handsome, significantly younger, and mysteriously well rewarded. At first, the royal generosity raised eyebrows. Then it raised taxes. Esme Stuart, a French cousin who caught James's attention early in his reign, was showered with titles and access. The bond between them was so intense that Scottish nobles staged a literal revolt to have Stuart removed, accusing him of corrupting the king, politically and otherwise. James relented, publicly, but the pattern repeated. In England, his affections turned toward Robert Carr and later George Villiers, who would become the infamous Duke of Buckingham. With each new favourite, the king's court erupted in factionalism. Letters between James and Villiers survive to this day, laced with such intimate language that historians eventually stopped calling them ambiguous. One letter from James reads, "I desire only to live in this world for your sake." Another concludes, "I shall ever love you." That might sound standard for the 17th century, an age when flowery language was fashionable, but even by that standard, the correspondence leans heavily into what modern readers would recognize as romantic intensity. The scandal wasn't just in the relationships themselves, it was in the promotions, land grants, and influence these favourites gained. Buckingham, in particular, amassed enormous power, leading military campaigns and shaping royal policy. Parliament seethed, the court gossiped, but James stood firm, defending his favourites with stubborn loyalty. Did these relationships cross into romance, intimacy? James himself never addressed it directly, and the records, while revealing, stop short of confession. But what's undeniable is that the favoritism itself was real, extreme, and politically destabilizing. The legacy of James's court isn't just literary, it's personal. A monarchy that blurred the lines between affection and governance, secrecy and spectacle. And now, from royal whispers to royal headlines, we arrive at the present day, where one scandal brought the entire House of Windsor into a global storm, involving jet-set billionaires, lawsuits, and a settlement that said everything without saying a word. 53. Prince Andrew and the quiet payout. For years, the rumours swirled around Prince Andrew, Duke of York, Queen Elizabeth II's second son. His friendship with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein raised eyebrows as early as the late 2000s, but what began as uncomfortable speculation quickly hardened into one of the most damaging scandals in the modern British monarchy's history. Andrew had long been known for his entitled behaviour and questionable associations, but in 2019, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit in the US, alleging that she had been trafficked by Epstein and forced into encounters with Prince Andrew when she was a minor. Andrew denied everything, emphatically. In fact, he went on television to say so, and that's when it got worse. His BBC Newsnight interview, intended to clear his name, became an instant disaster. He claimed he couldn't sweat due to a wartime injury. He said he didn't recall meeting Giuffre. He cited a Pizza Express birthday party as his alibi. What was meant to be a PR lifeline turned into a reputational sinkhole. In the aftermath, Andrew stepped back from royal duties. Charities distanced themselves. The Queen, his own mother, eventually stripped him of honorary military titles and royal patronages. Then came the settlement. In 2022, Prince Andrew reached an out-of-court agreement with Giuffre, reportedly in the millions. The deal included no admission of guilt, but in the court of public opinion, the optics were damning. A royal prince paying off a civil suit related to one of the most notorious criminal scandals of the century. Even worse, part of the settlement reportedly came from the Queen's private funds, adding another layer of public discomfort. The monarchy, long insulated from modern scandal by ceremony and tradition, suddenly looked painfully human. The royal family tried to draw a line under it. Andrew disappeared from view, but the stain remained, not just on him, but on the institution. This wasn't a case of misunderstood alliances or historical interpretation. It was contemporary, confirmed, and final. And there, at the end of our long parade of royal absurdities, betrayals, indulgences, and entanglements, sits this final truth. The crown may shine, but it does not sanctify. History remembers, regardless of titles. 53 scandals across continents and centuries. Some farcical, some tragic, all real, all confirmed. And yet, after all this, what remains unexplained is how these stories keep happening again and again. Maybe it's not the crown that corrupts. Maybe it's the mirror that royalty can't stop admiring.